everybody. Welcome once again to the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Fredland, and as always, we are sponsored by Running Aces Racetrack and Casino, and we'll kind of get right into it. We're really excited. We got Matt Matros joining us, as well as several of the recognizable Rec Poker panelists. We got Nels and Chris and Rob and John joining us, and maybe some others will kick in as well. But Matt, first of all, thank you for taking the time, and I know we kind of rescheduled here last minute, but thanks for joining us on the call.
Oh, you're perfectly welcome, Steve. Thanks for having me.
And now, where are you located? Are you out in Brooklyn, or where are you at?
Brooklyn, New York.
Still out there, okay.
Yes, never left. I've been living here for 15 years.
Well, you never left, and you've been living. You're older than 15.
That's true. Meaning I never left. What I meant by that was I never left during the great online poker disappearance of 2010, when a lot of online players left the United States entirely, or never left to go to Vegas or Atlantic City. I stayed living in Brooklyn the whole time.
Nice. Okay. Well, now we got connected through Eileen Sutton, and we had her on. We were talking about women in poker, and she said, "Hey, do you know Matt Matros?" I said, "Well, I don't have any connection to him." And she's like, "Well, let me introduce you." And you were gracious enough to come on the show. So, here's kind of your chance to call out Eileen and give us embarrassing moments about her, or
Well, I assume I have Eileen to thank for you pronouncing my name correctly, so that works out very well.
You don't. I had heard your name before, and I thought I had it right, but I will admit I went on to YouTube and watched a couple of videos about you trying to win your fourth straight bracelet, whatever, and they referred to Matt Matros. So I'm like, okay, that must be it then. So I will admit I did a little research.
By then they had it right. The first couple, they really didn't get it most of the time, but by then they seemed to have it. Yeah. No, Eileen's great. I met Eileen through the New York Writers Coalition, which is a great organization based here that provides writing to underserved communities. So there's workshops in prisons here. There are workshops for homeless youth. There are workshops for senior citizens. So it's a really great organization I've been proud to work with. I don't do as much with them as I used to, but that is where I met Eileen.
Oh man, that is fantastic. I know we have a writer on the panel too. Chris Jones is a writer as well, and I know that a lot of respect for you guys.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for serving the community in that way as well. Well, let's start a little bit. So I know you're a Yale graduate, so why don't we talk a little bit about what was your kind of your education growing up? What were your interests? What was your major? What were you involved in?
Sure. It's almost ancient history at this point. I'm going to my
Right.
20th reunion this weekend, which is crazy. But yes, I was at Yale. I was a math major, but I studied lots of other things. But math was my focus, and it was senior year at Yale when I actually started taking poker a bit seriously, or even playing at all. I only learned the rules of Hold'em my senior year of college, and read my first couple of poker books and tried it for the first time. I played poker a bit in high school, but really with no idea what I was doing. I needed some kind of structure to really focus my play and to make me understand that it was a game that you could actually succeed in. And I think my early experience reading poker books is partially why I continue to write poker books today.
Did you no, I'm a math guy too. I'm an actuary by trade and all that jazz.
You took a lot of tests to.
I took a lot of tests. Yeah,
I've looked into that before. I was like, wait a minute, what do I have to do? No, I'm not doing this.
People have asked me all the time, "Would you do it again?" I'm like, I don't know. Especially now that I'm not doing it anymore. Like I waited until I got successful and then quit it. But I'm kind of curious, like from your perspective, just as a math guy, quote unquote, and obviously you had other interests. You're a writer, so you have both sides of the brains functioning well. But as you got into poker, did you find it difficult to kind of realize that poker wasn't just a math game, that obviously the psychology piece of it? Because I know I struggled with that, going from, okay, now I understand the math, but boy, people are winning pots without doing the right mathematical thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been drawn to both aspects of the game. When I played as a kid, it was almost purely social. I didn't even know there was a mathematical aspect. But when I did start learning the math, I think my bread and butter game when I first started out was limit hold'em. And honestly, if you have a strong mathematical approach to limit hold'em, you're very happy when you don't understand what the people are doing, because usually that just means you can call and you're getting the right odds and everything's fine. It's a little bit trickier in no limit. No limit doesn't lend itself quite as easily to a pure math guy to come in and dominate. Now, nowadays, the strategies are so advanced that maybe you can do that. But when I was first learning, it wasn't as simple as if you just, in limit hold'em, it was basically play these good starting hands, play them aggressively, value bet them all the time, and you will succeed against a typical limit hold'em player. there was no real equivalent for that for No Limit Hold'em. And so you had to go a little bit beyond just learning the sort of basic theory behind value betting and setting up your ranges and when to bluff and how to construct your good starting ranges and just knowing pot odds and things like that. That was all helpful, but that wasn't really enough necessarily right away. Although I got to say, in the early days of poker, it almost was, because even 15 years ago when I was first starting out, the typical very good poker player was, by today's standards, a terrible poker player. So it was, you could get pretty far just doing that, but eventually you did have to go a lot further.
I'm really sad that I missed out on all that, because I just started playing poker, I don't know, 8-9 years ago, and everybody tells me, oh, the game used to be so easy. I'm like, well, hey, I missed out on that whole piece of it. So in college, you really kind of started playing a bit more. Kind of take me from college to, I guess, prior to 2010, your first World Series of Poker bracelet. Like, had you started playing the World Series all the way through there? Were you getting more and more serious? Like, what did that kind of look like from a poker perspective for you?
Sure. So I graduated college in '99. I worked for a software company for the next 3 years, and I was playing poker as a hobby, going to Atlantic City as often as I could. I played in a monthly home game. When I went to grad school for fiction writing in 2002, and that's when I started taking poker a bit more seriously, because instead of having a job where I was making money, I was paying tuition, and I needed to find a way to have money again. So I took poker more seriously. I considered myself a semi-pro, quote unquote, at that time. And then toward the end of my time in grad school, I won a satellite to a satellite, and then I won that satellite, and then I used that to enter the $25,000 buy-in World Poker Tour Championship at Bellagio, and I came in third. And so all of a sudden I had this massive bankroll. And since that time, I've been playing poker as my primary source of income since then, as far as going from 2004 to 2010 for my first bracelet. Yes, I played the World Series pretty much every summer, and I had quite a bit of success actually at the World Series before I ever won a bracelet. I had a pretty good ROI. I had a lot of limit hold'em, especially final tables. Also a no limit final table in 2008, which was back then a big deal because it was a $1,500 buy-in, which had 2,600 entrants in it, and the pay structure wasn't quite as steep at the final table as it is now. So just by coming in sixth, I was able to win almost 100 buy-ins. So that was nice too. And then in 2010, it finally did all come together. I had almost every, I never had a second, but I had almost every other finishing position at a World Series final table before I finally won one. So that was very gratifying. Every bracelet is great, but there's nothing like your first one.
Yeah, I've enjoyed every one of mine. So, well, yeah, like, I mean, it's super cool, right? I mean, obviously 2010. So you win the first bracelet. I mean, you've been knocking on the door. Was it one of those things that for you was like, man, if I could just do this, I really prove myself? Or was it just, well, I'm just playing the tournament and I know if I keep putting myself in the situation, eventually it'll happen? Like, what kind of, was there an emotional piece of it for you? Or is it more of a logical, yeah, well, of course, eventually I'm going to win one if I keep putting myself in the position of playing well? Was it, did you feel like it really put you on the map personally? Did that matter to you? Kind of what was all wrapped up in winning that bracelet?
Yeah, it's a bit of everything. There definitely was an emotional element to it. I mean, from the logical side, I'd had a lot of near misses, and I would be frustrated and talk to other really good professionals. And they all said exactly what you said. Like, look, you keep knocking on the door, eventually you're going to have to win one. That's how the cards work. I mean, if you're playing to win and you keep coming close, eventually you're going to have to win. And I kind of believe that, but at the same time, what had been lacking on my resume was a first place finish somewhere. I was already kind of a known poker player by 2010. I had been writing for Card Player magazine for 6 years since my WPT championship appearance in 2004. I'd had a fair bit of success online, so I was known in the early online community, but I never really had a win anywhere. I never had like a big first. I had won kind of these, the rinky-dink $11 rebuy or whatever on PokerStars or some $100 tournament at Foxwoods, but I didn't have any major wins, and it did feel like a bit of a monkey on my back. So there was quite a bit of relief to it. I didn't want to be known. I didn't want to be as old as I am now, and I have people say that Matt Matros, he's the best player to never win a bracelet. I really didn't want that to follow me around. So it did feel like a big relief, and it did feel like, okay, my resume, even if I don't play any more poker, my poker resume is I don't want to say complete, but I'm happy with it now. Yeah.
Right. And that was a limit hold'em event, right?
It was. Yeah. And that's the other thing is that, well, at some point though, I wanted to win a no limit tournament. I was lucky enough to do that in 2012 because everyone kind of knew me even by 2010 as a limit specialist. And I actually made the final table of the next limit tournament I played after winning the bracelet. And there was talk right then in 2010, oh, is Matros going to win
Back
two?
to back.
And then I came in ninth because that's what happens. But I had a lot of success in limit tournaments, and so to be able to add the no limit piece was pretty gratifying as well. And I think that's part of the reason I've been kind of okay backing down with my World Series schedule in recent years.
Now, if I understood you correctly, you were sort of maybe I misunderstood, but you were kind of moving during that phase from limit to no limit. Was that an intentional move? Because I mean, I look at your bracelets, and okay, 3 consecutive years. Congratulations. I mean, amazing. But we went from limit hold'em to mixed limit, no limit hold'em to no limit hold'em. Like, I mean, the pattern was sort of there. Was that an intentional move, or was that just sort of happenstance that that was the order of things?
Mostly happenstance. I mean, my WPT championship finish in 2004 was, of course, no limit hold'em.
Yeah.
I've been playing no limit hold'em tournaments seriously all along. Having said that, limit hold'em was always my bread and butter. I never was much of a no limit hold'em cash game player. Almost all 90% of the cash games I played were limit hold'em, and so I was exclusively a no limit tournament player. Having said that, I had played no limit tournaments over the years, again with some success online. I had a 7th in another WPT, which didn't count as like a final table because the TV final table was 6. But I was at the final table of people playing, and like I said, I had that other World Series no limit final table, so it wasn't like it was completely out of the blue. But I didn't, like I said, I had not had the big first place no limit finish until I won that 6 max tournament in 2012. So it was very nice to add that to the resume. I will say though that in all 3 tournaments that I won, you would not believe the quality of the cards I got. I mean, it's almost obvious in hindsight. You can't beat 1,600 people without running amazingly good. But when you actually have it happen to you, I just kept shaking my head like, how did I just win another huge coin flip? How did I just get it in as a 3-1 favorite and have it hold up again? Like, how does this keep happening? It's really crazy. And you realize then that the knocking on the door thing really does make sense because your strong play can only take you. You're not gonna beat 2,000 people in 3 days on your play alone. You're gonna have to have the cards. Maybe in the main event, something like that, where it's 7 days, you can get away with not having the greatest cards for a couple days and then get a rush on day 4 or whatever. But in a tournament that's going to be over in 2 or 3 days, you just have to have a run of cards. And I don't know if there are too many poker players out there who are like would be great if they would just run a bit better. But there are certainly a lot of guys, online players especially, who really think that I just haven't run good in brick and mortar, and that's why I've never done anything. And you kind of believe them because some of these people have had a lot of success online. So it's tricky when you're analyzing players based on how many bracelets they have, because really there's an underappreciated amount of luck in those tournaments.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very well said. I mean, obviously you have to put yourself in the position, but right. I think it's very humble, but I also think it's very well said. I mean, I think as math guys, understanding, statistical distributions and that sort of thing, you kind of get it. It's a little bit easier to kind of grasp those concepts that seem to escape some people. Now you mentioned that kind of now you've sort of, I guess, pared back a bit of your playing kind of what's your focus area now? Talk a little bit about what are you playing? What are you writing? What's kind of going on in your world right now?
Sure. Well, I became a father 2 years ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's great. It's also amazingly time consuming and amazingly expensive. So that's been interesting. But that because my wife works full time and because I do have flexibility in my schedule, a lot of the parenting fell on me, especially early on. We have a fair bit of daycare now, so it's not quite as big a burden as it was before. I was able to play one of my first tournaments in a while this past weekend, actually. But my poker, I've not played the World Series either the past 2 years. And because I've been missing poker, though, I started at the beginning of this year to work on a book, which it will be out by the time your listeners hear this podcast. It's called The Game Plan. And it came from this idea of I've played a lot of poker and enjoyed playing with a lot of casual players who really want to do well, and they play 1 or 2 tournaments a year maybe, and I see them in Atlantic City and I see them in Vegas, and there's a lot of players like this, and they're really they're trying to learn the game, or they're a home game player who really enjoys the game, but there's something really holding them back in the major events, and usually what's holding them back is they're scared to go broke because they don't play enough for these tournaments. So I wanted to write a book that just gives these players a bunch of rules to prevent them from doing anything too unreasonable at the table, and then give themselves a real chance by playing essentially a tight, aggressive strategy where they're not folding too often either, and give themselves a real chance to win money. So again, the book is called The Game Plan: How Casual Players Become Threats in No Limit Hold'em Tournaments. And I'm very pleased with how it turned out. I thought it was going to be easy to write when I started it. I was like, sure, I'll just tell the casual players what to do and they'll be fine. And then I started trying to come up with this list of rules for how to play No Limit Hold'em at a reasonable level. And it turns out the task I set for myself was much harder than I ever. So what I thought was going to be like a 75-page book is turning into closer to 200 pages. Maybe it's not quite 200, but it's still designed for someone to be able to digest it in a period of a week or 2 if necessary, or even less if they want to really cram. And use the strategy of the game plan and give pros fits in a major tournament. It's not going to turn them into a pro, but it will give them a chance, which is really the point. Because a lot of these players are really coming in with strategies that are too poor to have any reasonable chance of success. That's what I wanted to change.
I love it. We did talk about that a little bit offline as far as trying to have it, have this episode released when people can get the book and that sort of thing. And, I think it's one of those books that I'd love to look at. Maybe that's one of the book studies that we do. We also do some of these community groups because what we're all about here at with Rec Poker is trying to learn the game in community. So we're kind of dialoguing and, having a group of people. And it seems like that sounds like one of those books. Maybe you would agree that would be really suitable for a group of people to kind of study together.
Absolutely. I think that would be fantastic. I think one of the things I like about the book is it could be of interest to anyone. It's designed for casual players or beginning players if they want to jump in and not lose money right away. I think that's a big obstacle for some beginners, is that they want to learn poker, but if they just start playing, they're getting crushed early on. They don't want to go through a period of where they're losing a bunch of money. And so one way to use the game plan if you're a beginner is, okay, you're not going to get crushed if you follow this strategy. And then as you learn more about poker, you can start moving away from the game plan as you find yourself ready to do so. But the point is you won't have this massive loss of bankroll leading up to that. But also, if you're a more experienced player, it's an interesting idea, right? What rules would you give a beginner to not get destroyed in a No Limit Hold'em tournament? Would you have written the rules the way I did? Would you have tried to have a beginner play a certain way in another situation? Would you have made it more complicated than I did or less complicated? I don't know if you remember this if you only came into poker a few years ago, but if you've seen David Sklansky's tournament poker book that he wrote in the early part of the century, he introduced something he called the system, which was kind of a even much more simpler way to do what I tried to do with the game plan, where he gave beginners, basically said, okay, just start moving all in, and these are the hands you're going to move all in with. And that was the way they would play. They didn't have to know the rules. They didn't have to understand what beats what to play the system. And the idea was if somehow you found yourself seated in a poker tournament, even though you don't play poker, which is not really realistic, but that was the thought experiment, this was your best chance. I thought that was interesting. I kind of wanted to take that to a different level, which is, okay, you do know how to play poker. You don't know how to play it especially well. How can you have the best? That's kind of the question I was giving myself. And I think it's interesting for anyone to think about, not just beginning players. So that's why I think my book could be very interesting for a discussion like you're describing.
Yeah, that sounds great. I don't know if you want to give away any of the book. Can you give us an example kind of one of those, maybe out of context it doesn't make sense, but any sort of one of those rules that's part of the book? Sure.
Well, for example, while it's not a completely hard and fast rule, for the most part, I have beginners playing a raise or fold or re-raise or fold strategy before the flop. So the one thing a lot of beginners will do is they'll limp behind limpers or they'll cold call raises, and they don't understand that it's actually very hard to win too many pots after the flop if you were not the aggressor pre-flop, if you don't have the initiative. And when pros do it, they have a good sense of why they're doing it and what they should be doing on the flop if they're not going to be the aggressor pre-flop. But when amateur players do it, basically they're just playing passively, and then they get to the flop, and if they don't hit, they fold. And you just can't make money in poker doing that because the person who is the aggressor is probably betting most of the time on the flop. So to protect amateurs from themselves, which is kind of like my idea behind the book, I basically just have them raising and re-raising and hardly ever flat calling, with a few exceptions. The big blind is one exception, and occasionally I let them try to flat call with a pair to try to flop a set. So, but aside from that, I pretty much, if someone raises and you're following the game plan, you should pretty much be re-raising or folding, not calling. And I think almost no beginner actually plays that way, and almost every beginner would do better if they did play that way. That's just one example of something you can find in the book.
No, that's great. And I know now you're also doing a fair amount of writing. You're also doing a fair amount of coaching, and you're playing some. Is that an accurate
Yeah,
depiction?
I haven't been playing much, but I played the WPT Deep Stacks event this weekend at Parks, the main event. Parks is, as you probably know, outside Bensalem, Pennsylvania, casino just outside of Philly, and they have a big stack series. I think 5 or 6 times a year they have a series like this, and it's a pretty good value and it's a good structure. And I really enjoyed playing this tournament. I actually busted just outside the money in a kind of interesting situation. If you did want to dive into that,
let's do it.
Let's do it. That was the first tournament I played in a while. Well, okay, so there are 6. Just set the scene here. There are 60 players left. There are 47 places getting paid. First place is about 116,000, and the min cash is about 2,500, which in context is about 1 2/3 buy-ins. It was a 1,500 buy-in, modulo the juice, but it was like a 1,500 buy-in. And so in the hand in question, I started the hand with 126,000. The blinds are 3,000, 5,000, with the big blind anteing 5,000. I opened from the hijack with Jack 10 offsuit for 11,000. The button, who is the chip leader who had all the chips and who ended up winning, just kept getting more and more chips as it turns out, and ended up winning the tournament today. This guy he won every showdown in this table that I played with him right before the money, and apparently he kept doing that after they got to the money. Every time I checked the scoreboard, he was just like 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, 3 million. It was nuts.
It was kind of like your World Series runs.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But anyway, he calls on the button and the big blind calls. So we go to the flop with 41,000 in the middle. And I have the jack of spades and the 10 of diamonds. Okay. The flop is the 9 of spades, the 8 of clubs, and the 5 of spades. So I have flopped 2 overcards, an open-ended straight draw, and a backdoor spade draw. I have 115,000 left after pre-flop action. The big blind checks. My first decision is whether to go for a check raise or whether to just bet out. And my thought process was I really don't want to let a free card come off and have both opponents still be in the hand when they could easily have a lot of hands they're going to fold right here and now. I do want to, the argument for check raising is, well, then I can't put myself in as difficult a situation. If the chip leader bets, which he probably will a lot of the time, if I check, then I can just shove and have the fold equity and not worry about having to call off and all in. But I do risk him checking behind, which then lets both players possibly hit something on the turn that they will now call with, where I could have just won the pot on the flop. And so I basically decided that I would rather have my chance of winning the pot right now. I don't want to give up that opportunity. So that's why I decided to bet 18,000. The chip leader immediately shoves in a bunch of chips, enough to put either of us all in, who has 2 opponents in the hand. And the big blind then folds. So now it's back to me, and I have 97,000 left after making this bet. And so if I call and win, I will have 271,000 in chips at the blinds of 3 and 5. And we're about to go to 3 and 6, by the way, just a few minutes.
Yep.
And we're 13 players away from the money again. If I fold, I will have 97,000 at this 3-5 and soon to be 3-6 level. So I'm getting about pretty close to 1.8 to 1 on my money, slightly less, I think, but pretty close to it. And it's extremely clear that if the money was not a consideration, if we were not close to the bubble, this would be an automatic slam dunk call, because I could easily have be a favorite in this hand, or at the very least have quite a bit of equity. And so getting 1.8 to 1 as a favorite is not a borderline spot in any way. It's a very clear call. What made it slightly complicating is that we were close to the money. And so I had to decide how much equity I really thought I had, and then was it worth it to get my chips in. And a few things went to my mind. First of all, the way he put the chips in, and you never know about these things for certain when you're playing, but I've come to trust my intuition a fair bit over the years. And just sitting at the table and being there when he moved in and sitting across from him and looking at him, I was pretty confident what he had was like a 9, either a 9 or 7s or 6s. I did not think he flopped a set, and I did not think he had something like 9-8 for top 2. Those are, of course, possible hands. He probably would have played them similarly, but that's not the read I had sitting there. So that was one factor, is that I felt pretty strongly that all my outs were likely good. My biggest worry was that he had either 2 7s to take away some of my straight outs, and of course, also if I could hit the straight and he could fill up if he had 2 7s, or he had something like 10-9 or Jack-9, which would tie up some of my Jack and 10 outs. But the most likely hand I thought for him was Ace-9. And, I don't know if maybe I'm being results oriented, but that was part of my decision process. I really don't think so. Now, if he does have Ace-9 without a spade, I'm actually a small favorite over him, and I don't think I can reasonably fold even 13 from the money, which, by the way, is not 1 from the money.
Right.
It's still 13 from the money, where I'm going to have a pretty short stack, and I'm going to play like me afterwards. So there's a pretty decent chance I'm going to miss the money anyway, if I fold this hand, which also went into my thinking. If we had been 1 away from the money, I think I would have had to just shove this flop to make sure that I didn't put myself. I would have just overbet shoved and not had to think about this and risk bubbling, but making him have a hand to call to do this, not make some play like this with 2 7s or whatever. But 13 away from the money is still pretty far. And to be one of a bunch of short stacks who's definitely going to play more aggressively than the other short stacks, that also factored into my thinking. So anyway, I ended up getting the chips in. My read was spot on. He had Ace-9, and now he randomly didn't have a spade. He could have easily had Ace-9 with the spade, which would have knocked down my equity a little bit. But he didn't. He had Ace-9, no spade. So I actually was a small favorite. I had about 52% equity, which I was pretty pleased with. Obviously, I didn't hit, or I wouldn't be telling you this story. But I was on the way home. I felt reasonably comfortable with the decision. If I estimate my equity as around 50% or slightly lower, then I have to call 97, and I'd be worth about 135 or so in the pot. So starting stacks were 30,000, and so just in terms of like chips, converting chips to cash EV, that's more than a buy-in. Now they're not worth their full value at that point because we're getting close to the money, but you have to discount it quite a bit to get to the point where it's not a good call. Because the other calculation I did on the way home, and again, this is after the hand, not during the hand, was, okay, I'm clearly about 50% to bust if I play this hand, but I think I'm about 20% to bust before the money anyway if I have a short stack and we're still 13 away. Mm-hmm. So I go from like 50% chance of that 2,500 min cash to an 80% chance, which only results in a few $100 difference in EV. So it's like $1,250 value of the pure dollars value from busting right immediately versus around, I guess, 1,900. What would 80% of? Yeah, it was to be like
somewhere around $700 somewhere in there.
2,000 even. So yeah, it's like $750. So that's like half a buy-in. And so I don't think we can discount the value of chips, which were, if they were purely linear, would be worth like 1.2 buy-ins or something. I just don't see how that's discounted all the way down to half a buy-in in that situation. And so coming home, I was pretty pleased with the decision. And I also know that just the way I play tournaments, this is how I've played tournaments my whole life, which is that, and this is the period of tournaments my whole life where I've taken the most advantages just before the bubble, when people start playing too tight too quickly, trying to get into the money. It does make sense to play pretty tight if you're 1 or 2 away from the bubble, and you can really just bump up to that 1.5 buy-ins or whatever immediately. But if you're still 13 people away and you could still get 0 buy-ins pretty easily, it just doesn't make sense to me to pass up on a clearly massively plus chip EV situation like that. Whether I should have bet out and then allowed myself to get raised is another story, and I'm not entirely sure I like my decision to bet in the first place, but I do think once I bet that I made the right decision to call. So that's a long story of the strategy of this, my bust out hand.
That's good. I have I have several questions. A couple of them, one would be, do you ever just, just check there hoping to see the draw because of the tournament situation would be one. I mean, I know you like to be aggressive. The second one is, as we're continuing to try to learn more and more about how we're thinking ahead of these things. I mean, when you put the 18K in, were you kind of already thinking of what you're going to do against a re-raise and just weren't expecting the big shove? Or kind of what was your process there when you put the 18K in? What were you thinking about as far as potential reactions from your opponents? Or did you just kind of expect to take it down or just get flatted?
So to answer your first question, if I had been last to act, I would have given a lot more consideration to checking and taking the free card, because now I'm not so worried about getting to the turn at all without having to put all my stack in, because obviously I can just see the turn if I want to. Whereas if with the player behind me, even if I check, I might still have to get it all in before I see the turn, or at least face a bet from another opponent. Whereas I know that that's not going to happen. I probably would have bet anyway, but if I had been last to act, I might have given a little more consideration to checking to do what you're saying, which is to take the free card.
Because you just think there's a super high likelihood that the button was going to bet there.
I think if I check, he's going to bet a lot of his range. Yeah, I mean, he's the chip leader, so it does make sense. Now, he wasn't playing like a wild maniac chip leader, so I do think he checks back with stuff like, I don't know, ace queen, ace jack, under pairs to the board, all things that I really want him to fold. And that's why I ultimately decided. But having said that, sure, I would consider checking if I thought it made sense. I mean, what you kind of want to do in these bubble situations or near bubble situations is you want to engineer the betting so that you're the one moving in if you can. Because now it's hard for someone else to call you because they don't want to bubble either. Now, it doesn't really affect the chip leader who doesn't care. He's not in danger of busting, but everyone else is. So for the most part, they don't want to risk a big portion of their stack any more than you do. And so if you can figure out a way to get all in first, you're usually at some kind of advantage. So a lot of times, yes, checking back would make sense for that reason, because then I could then one of those, and this is really the reason why I think being last to act might have made more sense to check, which is that now I can more easily shove over my opponent's bet. Now his automatic bet comes on the turn instead of on the flop. And now I can see what the turn card is and then decide whether I want to shove, or now my hand might have gone way down in value after the turn, and now I can decide to pass. And I can make my decision without committing as much money right away. So I think in position, I would have liked the checking option more. As it turns out, I still consider checking for the exact reason I'm saying, which is that the best way for me to go all in first for here is to go for the check raise. And again, I think ultimately the reason I didn't was I didn't want to I wanted to let him fold all these better hands that might either decide to call on the turn if I showed weakness on the flop, or could hit something on the turn and make them call. And the other factor was that I thought my draw, and to get to the second half of your question, I thought my draw was probably strong enough that if he decided to shove in, I could probably call with it. But I hadn't fully decided yet to answer your question, and it's partially because it was a little bit based on my read. If I thought more likely that he actually had flopped a straight or a set or something, I might have folded right there in the flop. But it really did not feel that way to me. I wish I could describe it better than that. It's not like I saw him flick his nose or something, or had some weird body language tell like that. But it felt like ace-9. It was ace-9, and so I went with my calculation based on giving him something like that. And I think for the most part, I'm more or less okay with it because I did have such a good draw. But I think actually with maybe with a slightly worse draw, I might have been better off checking and then either check raising all in or just deciding to check fold if I have a better read. But I knew I couldn't possibly check fold a hand this good, a draw this good. So if I'm going to be check raising all in, and that's the other thing is I don't know how often this guy was going to bet and then fold anyway, because like I said, I think with some of his weakest hands, he does just check back, and he hits so many chips that I think if he bets and I shove, he probably is just calling. But those are good questions, though, and I wouldn't really fault anyone for playing. I wouldn't think those were like terrible plays or anything. I think I did definitely considered checking the flop, and I'm still not 100% convinced I played it correctly. But that's why I played it the way I did that.
No, I appreciate that. That's just so helpful to kind of hear the thought process. That's what we're trying to learn the principles. Not okay exactly how do you play Jack 10 when there's two overs and a straight draw, but kind of the principles behind it. So that's why it's so helpful to have you kind of walk through the process of what you're thinking. I think the more we hear this sort of thinking from different people, get different perspectives, that just helps us learn the game a ton. And the last question I have, then, if other guys have questions, feel free. But, a lot of the calculations that you were talking about kind of now saying, okay, well, there's a 20% chance I was going to lose the tournament and, whatever. Kind of the process of thinking that through in terms of tournament equity and what's the right, sort of ICM value play. Are you actually thinking about some of that during that decision, or is that now kind of after the fact as you're driving home, kind of doing that sort of a calculation?
Right. At the table, I did not put a number on what are my chances of still busting before the money if I fold this hand. I didn't get as far as putting a number on that when I was playing the hand. I did put a number in as I was playing the hand of, well, I think I have about 50% equity against this range. That's something I did think about while playing the hand. And what I did think about while playing the hand was there's some kind of reasonable chance that I still bust before the money anyway. I didn't put a number on it. That's a number I'm just making up, by the way. It's just like my best
right
guess.
For sure.
It might be higher, it might be lower than 20%, but that's, in thinking about it, knowing that there were still 13 players to go, knowing that I was soon going to be on a roughly 15 big blind stack and playing it aggressively because that's how I play. I thought 20% seemed a reasonable guess.
Right.
And it might even be higher because, I had the chip leader at my table who's going to be more inclined to call me than at some other table. Like if I were at a table with a bunch of other 15 big blind stacks, my chances of cashing are much higher. But at this particular table, yeah, probably only an 80% chance of cashing if I fold. And so, I mean, to answer your question, no, I didn't quite calculate my chances of cashing at the table, or guess. Calculate's the wrong word because it's not a calculation; it's just an estimate. But I did factor in, like, okay, I'm an aggressive player. I'm never going to fold my way to the money anyway with 13 players still left to go. So I might as well take a massively plus chip EV spot. Now, having said that, if I had turned out I had like 40, I thought I had like 40% equity getting 1.8 to 1 there, I think I probably would have folded, because now I'm like, well, I don't think that earlier in the tournament I would jump at a chance to take 1.8 to 1 and a 40% shot. But when we're that close to the money, I would have said, okay, I'll take my pretty decent chance of cashing here instead of this, plus chip EV spot, but not wildly plus chip EV spot. But when I calculated that, well, I think I'm 50% as a 1.8, getting 1.8 to 1. I just didn't think I could pass it on it.
And we had a question that came up. Eric Anderson, who's not actually on the video, but he's listening in. He said, you estimated 50% equity. And his question is kind of a basic one. How did you learn to estimate equity? Like,
Sure.
Obviously you can do all the off the felt stuff and kind of really figure it out using calculators. But how did you learn how to estimate it kind of on the fly?
Right. So some of your listeners are probably familiar with the rule of 4, which says that on the flop, if you're going to get it all in, if you multiply your outs by 4, you roughly get the percent chance you have of hitting one of those outs. So in this hand, I had 8 outs for the open-ender, 6 more outs for overcard, so that's 14 outs if they're all good. And then I did have the jack of spades, which also did factor into my thinking, which is a backdoor flush draw, which if it's good, that sort of counts as like one more out. So if I did have 15 clean outs, then I have rule of 4 would say 60%. It starts breaking down right around there, so it's probably closer to, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's like 56% or something like that. But I knew it wouldn't be that high because some of those outs, first of all, they might not all be good, but even if they are all good, your opponent, of course, if he has ace-9, could hit an ace or a 9, and some of those outs you could hit might not be good anymore. And so that's why I had to discount it a little bit, and that's why I was estimating off the cuff 50%. It turned out to be 52% when I went home and put the numbers in. But that's also partially because he had the perfect hand for me. He had exactly what I wanted him to have. So it was a little higher than the number I was coming up with. If he did have 10-9 or Jack-9 and I lose 3 of my outs, then I'm in a little bit worse shape. I'm probably closer to like 46 or something percent.
Right.
Or even lower, actually. So if he had one of those hands, it might not have made as much sense. So for that reason, it's not quite, maybe it was not quite as clear, although I still think even if the reason why I did end up calling is like, even if I'm off by a little bit on this 50%, it's still clearly plus EV from his chip standpoint by kind of a lot. And so I thought there was enough wiggle room there to justify calling. But to answer your listener's question or your panelist's question, I use the rule of 4 to get a baseline estimate, and I think about what hands I could hit that my opponent could hit, or that I could hit that might not be good, or my opponent can still improve, and kind of adjust up or down. So, and if you look at enough of these simulations, you'll see these kind of like 15 outs against an underpair, and it ends up being exactly 50%. And I really kind of knew that I was suspected strongly that I was looking at a situation kind of like that. With this particular read I had, but that shouldn't be discounted either, though, because if you range your opponent there to have, for example, sets over pairs and straights and stuff, you're not gonna end up wanting to call this hand, and so you have to take into account your hand reading abilities, knowing that this player would never have flatted pre-flop with an overpair. This player would probably not have flatted pre-flop even with 7-6, maybe suited. And then you have to develop the intuition, which only comes from playing, I think, which is that when you watch someone kind of shove a stack of chips in, like, was that really a set or a straight? Wouldn't a set or straight try to look a little more casual? Didn't that just kind of look like ace-9? And it did. So, and that's all you really have to develop a feel for that. I don't really know how to teach someone to do that except to play enough and watch someone who has a straight and watch someone who has ace-9 and see how they do it differently. And then even factoring in all that, you have to try to avoid thinking too hard about the results, because it's easy for me to say, oh, I knew what he had ace-9. I didn't know. I had my best guess. It turned out to be right, but he didn't have to have that. He could have turned over a straight or a bottom set, and I might have looked sillier, and I might have been more wrong, quote unquote. But that's not really wrong. You're only ever dealing in probabilities and in percentages. And if my read is right there 90% of the time, that's great. And if it's right, 20% of the time, that's not so good. But that's going to look the same the times that he has ace-9. So you can't be too results oriented about this stuff.
Well said. Chris, Rob, Nels, any questions? Well, yeah. Well, we're almost at time here. Actually, we're a little bit over time, Matt. I promise you, this is just so good. The time just flies by. Chatting with you. I'd love to just hear a little bit about the book. If you can give us another 5 minutes or so. I guess unless there's more than one book, I'm aware of the one, the Making of a Poker Player: How an Ivy League Math Geek Learned to Play Championship Poker. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that and any other things that you've got published.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my first poker book, which came out a million years ago at this point, well, 14 years ago to be specific. I wrote it before I was before I was known at all in the poker world. I was just a writer who liked poker and wanted to try to write a poker book. And so I did, and it was about how someone would learn how to play poker, essentially. And then it turned out after I had written the book is when I made that final table at the Bellagio, and suddenly I was on TV playing poker. And so I had to add a final chapter to talk about that. And then all of a sudden it became like, oh, let's buy Matt Matros' book and learn how to be really good at poker. And so I'm pretty pleased with how that book turned out. I think it's a fun narrative, and hopefully people will read it and get a lot of good memories. And if they're a beginner, learn some things. But I think some people expected it to be like this intense strategy book where I was talking about like teaching game theory essentially. And that's not what it is. And it wouldn't have made sense for it to be that when I wrote it, because I wasn't someone anyone would listen to about that stuff. But it's a fun book. It's a how-to/memoir, as they say in the biz. And it's teaching poker through a story of how I learned how to play poker. And so meeting the people that I met that taught me how to play poker, and playing the tournaments that I played, and going through what I went through as a young player to eventually get to the point where I could compete in tournaments and have a chance to do reasonably well. That's where the book was supposed to end. But it turned out it ended like, and by the way, I did do really well shortly after I wrote this book. but that's the making of a poker player. And I haven't read it in a while, but I am still proud of it. I have read it enough times 15 years ago to know what's in there. And I'm grateful that it found an audience. I mean, thanks to the World Poker Tour appearance, I definitely sold more books than I think my publisher was expecting. And so I think it's something I look back on in my career. And I'm happy that it started with not just a tournament, but with a book, because I've always wanted to be known as a writer and a poker player. And after the book came out, I got the gig as a card player columnist, and I wrote more than 100 columns for Card Player magazine. And so I was able to have, a life as a poker writer and a poker player, which was great. Now, having said all that, you asked about my writing. What I spent a lot of time doing over the years is writing novels. I've written one that I tried to get an agent for a few years ago, and I've kind of shelved. And I'm working on another one now that I'm almost ready to send to agents again. Neither of them have been published. I won't say too much about them, but they have nothing to do with poker, and they're just something I'm passionate about doing for myself. And I think someday I would like to be known not just as a poker writer and a poker player, but as a novelist. But I have my whole life ahead of me to make that happen, and so hopefully someday it will.
Well, now you can write about being a father of a 2-year-old, and we weave those things in, right?
Oh man, that's a whole other thing.
It does change things for sure. Well, I want to honor your time, and I want to thank you for coming on. Any final words of wisdom to the Rec Poker Nation? Things that we should be paying attention to, encouragement, anything that you want to share there?
Well, definitely check out the game plan. I'm proud of it. It's going to be out when you hear this, and so it's over on Amazon. Pick it up. And yeah, I would say just talk to as many good players as you can. This discussion on this podcast is great. I think the more you listen and absorb, the more the game will start to make sense. And there's no quick way to be a pro, but I think you actually absorb a lot of information quickly and improve your game in leaps and bounds, especially when you're first starting out. That's the whole kind of point of the game plan, and I hope people read it.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Matt Matros. Appreciate you taking the time to be on. Thanks to Eileen Sutton for connecting us. Really appreciate it. This was really, really, really good stuff. Sometimes I just want to be inside your brain and try to keep up with how your brain is functioning. That was super impressive. But thanks for joining us. Feel free we're going to hang on here a little bit so you can just kind of leave the meeting whenever you'd like, and we're just going to kind of continue the conversation. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yep. Take care. All right, Rob, Chris, Nels, anybody that's, I guess, who's out here as well. Eric, John, thoughts?
Just I wish I could think that way when I'm sitting at the poker table.
What part was what you're hoping for?
Well, just the way he read the hand, the way he read the situation. I'd look at it and I go, damn, do I really want to risk? Do I really want to risk my tournament life right now on this draw? I mean, it's a great draw.
Yeah.
But, you had to read that the guy had probably a hand like an ace-9, maybe a king-9 or something like that, where his outs were live. But I don't know if I could have that same read, because I see monsters under every bed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm thinking, just to start that, start there with 35 bigs and you're getting close to the bubble. Do I open Jack 10 in the cutoff there or not? Which is exactly what the good players want you. But you got the big stack on your left and those sorts of things. But I really liked his thought about whether the percentage or all that kind of stuff. But just I think we get into this mode of, well, okay, if I lose, I'm out. Without really thinking about, but if I fold, there's still probably a good chance that I'm out too. You know what I mean? I think we sometimes don't really think that part of it through. Like, there's no guarantee we're going to make the money if we fold here.
Yeah, that's what I meant by his train of thought. It wasn't just that particular hand and what the results might or might not be, but if he folded right there, he knew that with the blinds going up, he's only going to have 15 big blinds left.
Right.
And now you're in that push fold mode with a huge chip stack. So how are you going to survive that? Like you said, if there was a bunch of 15 big blind stacks around him, it would be a much different situation. His odds of making the money would be much greater. But the fact that this guy could call on a whim with just about any two cards, made it very difficult for him to be able to do that.
And 20% of the field still had to be eliminated to make the money.
Right.
Like I said, it wasn't real close. Yeah, that was good. Other thoughts from you, Rob, Chris, Snells?
I really appreciated the fact that he talked about how much he thought about where he was going to be, if he makes this fold. There have been times when I have made that or gone through that thought process of, well, if I fold this, this is how many blinds I have left, and is it worth folding at this point? When we're this close to making the money, what am I going to have to do to continue on in this tournament? And there have been times when I've wondered if maybe I shouldn't even be considering that and just, going with the flow of the game and where I think I'm at. So I really like that he actually, verbalized that for us.
Yeah, for sure. So we got a question from John. Hey, John, too, if you want to just raise your hand if you want me to promote you to panelists for video and audio. But John had just asked in the chat if we could review the math he was talking about, kind of the rule of 4. So, yeah, I think that's a really critical thing, and I'm glad that you asked it. It's good for clarification. So basically, if you can figure out how many outs you think you have, so like he was on a Jack 10 with a 9-8-5 board. So he thinks that if a 7 or a queen comes, he's got a straight. He's got the nut straight. So he thinks he's got 8 outs there. Any 7, any queen. He also is thinking if a jack or a 10 come, he's probably good there because that would give him a higher pair than like an ace 9. So that's another 6 outs. There's 3 more 10s, 3 more jacks. So he has at that point, what did I say? 14 outs now. So he has 14 outs, and so there's the rule of 2 and the rule of 4, depending on how many cards are left to come. So if he were to get it all in there and get called, the way the math works is to figure out how much equity, what's the chance of you winning the hand, which is basically how much equity you have. If there's 2 cards to come and you have 14 outs, you multiply how many outs you have by 4, and that gets you 56%. But it sort of, falls apart a little bit, but it's kind of a rough estimate. So it basically tells you you're about a 50% chance to win that hand. The rule of 2 is just if there's 1 card to come. So that's kind of how you think about that. For each card, you multiply by 2. So hopefully that makes sense, John. Let me know in the chat if that didn't make sense. So if you have 5 outs and you get it all in on the flop, the rule of 4 would say you have a 20% chance of winning. If you have 15 outs, you'd have about a 60% chance of winning. So that's how the math kind of works. All right. Any other thoughts, comments? It's been a long night. I know the people that are listening to the podcast just think, oh, they just did a 45-minute podcast, and we've been on the air for quite a while, doing several of these interviews tonight, trying to get ready for Vegas. So this one is actually probably going to release like June 21st. So it'll be kind of late. We'll already have some good Vegas results. Hopefully, one of us on this panel will have a bracelet by then. So that's that's kind of the hope.
And the main event isn't until July, so.
So no, yeah, you don't have to worry about that. Rob's playing. No, Rob was on TV playing the main event. Rob, you got quads on TV, right?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so that's
Poker Go anyway.
Oh, Poker Go, yeah, still TV. Yeah. I still saw a video of you with quads.
Yes,
pretty sweet. Eric, did you have anything to say? I know we just kind of got you into the panelist role. Anything stand out from the night at all, or anything you want to share or ask?
Well, I like the way that they tied together between this podcast and the last one, where it all boiled down to position. His whole problem was he was out of position, and that was his whole dilemma. He said if I was in position, it would have been a lot easier to do.
That's a really good point.
And as far as that rule of 2 and 4, the way I remember it is for every out you have, multiply by 2, and then multiply that by how many cards are to come. If you only have 1 card to come or 2 cards to come.
Yep.
And where it breaks down is at 9 outs. For every out above 9, subtract the difference. So if you have 13 outs, 13 minus 9, you subtract 4. from your percentage from your 2 and 4 calculation.
Okay, that's how the breakdown works. Okay.
And that gets you pretty close.
Okay, I know I just kind of tweak it down, but I'm never really sure how. Okay. Yeah, and I think one thing about the rule of 2 and the rule of 4 is, that it really applies to an all-in situation, assuming you're calculating your outs correctly. I think where a lot of people where a mistake is made a lot of times where people chasing draws, like where it's not an all-in situation. So say in this spot right here, where it's a 9-8-4 or 9-8-5 board, he has Jack 10, and somebody bets, and so he's deciding. Let's just say it's a different situation, but somebody bets and he's just deciding if he should call. Okay, so he thinks he has 14 outs. Well, there's 2 cards to come, right? So I got a 56% chance of hitting my card. Well, then the turn card comes, and then they bet again, and then he folds. Because, really you only have a 28% chance of hitting your card on the turn. And I think that's one thing to remember about this is that rule of 2 and the rule of 4. The rule of 4 really only applies if it's an all-in situation. So I see that all the time where people are thinking, oh, I have a 56%, they do the rule of 4 and they think I got a 56% chance to win this. So the guy bets 3/4 pot and you think, well, I got the odds, so I'm going to call. And then you don't hit. And then the guy makes the same bet on the river and you're like, or on the turn. And then you're like, well, I got to fold because now I only have a 28% chance of hitting. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. If you're just going to be calling the turn versus shipping it all in, or calling the flop versus shipping it all in, you only have a 28% chance of hitting it on the next 1 card. So I think that's the one caveat I'd put in there. All right, guys. Well, I think let's wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much. I know a long night, but thanks for being part of this. I love having different questions bouncing off. Takes the pressure off me, but it's also, I think, just I learn a ton just from the questions that you guys are asking. I love it because you're thinking differently than I am. So thank you for that. And we'll touch base next week, I guess. Adios, everybody.
See ya. Have a good night.
Thanks, guys.
You guys too.